We are at the conclusion of Beyond Orders Rule 6, Abandon Ideology. The relatively simple rule name kinda hid how much of a complicated mess this was going to be to work through. But hey, we learned far more about Nietzsche and his writings than we knew before on this channel, and we're going to take that as a net positive. And that trend is going to continue in this video because I have got a spicy hot take for you. Jordan Burnt Peterson is one of the types of guys Nietzsche was warning us about. For which type of guy that is, you'll just have to wait and see. Or look at the thumbnail, but you know how YouTube works. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Welcome, and apologies in advance if this video is a bit off in ways. It's been a tricky month on the having a body front, especially one that's erroring. Let me also inform you at the outset that the majority of this video is not going to be emotionally heavy, but there is going to be a chunk that is. So I will warn you when we get there that it's coming, and you can also use the chapter markers to skip it when we get there. There will be timestamps, everything, so it's not going to catch you off guard. As this is finally the final part of this rule, let's refresh the earlier parts, because this has been quite the process. Section 1. The wrong places. Peterson says that society should, quote, inculcate responsibility in people, but oh no, we've messed up. We've been emphasizing people's rights over their responsibilities, because those are mutually exclusive boxes, apparently. And because we've been emphasizing the wrong things, the youths are looking for meaning in the wrong places. 2. Perhaps he is only sleeping. Thus began the Nietzscheing of this chapter, with the famous God is dead claim, and Peterson asserting, wrongly, that Nietzsche wrote this out of, quote, fear that the, quote, Judeo-Christian values serving as a foundation of Western civilization had been made dangerously subject to casual, rational criticism, and that God had been, quote, fatally challenged. This is so wrong, I want to re-argue the hows and whys, but fortune smiles upon us. We'll cover similar ground today, so I'll wait. Peterson continued by, wrongly, describing the two paths Nietzsche foresaw as a result of the death of God, nihilism, or, quote, identification with rigid, totalitarian ideology. He threw in Dostoevsky because he's following the 12 rules flow, to add that the, quote, comprehensive utopian ideology predicated on a few apparently self-evident axioms were going to be more dangerous than anything before it. Pivot to Nietzsche's Übermensch, where Peterson contextually missed or misrepresented things as an antidote to nihilism. But oh no, we can't have people inventing their own values. Freud and Jung said so. Somewhere Peterson isn't deigning to supply us with. Instead, our values have us, as indicated by our, quote, capacity for spontaneous revelatory experience. Also, Peterson argues that there haven't been any Übermensch, therefore it's impossible. But that we are in the two doom boxes Nietzsche foretold. Supposedly. And then there's this weird tangent about value being an inherent part of reality despite not being a, quote, scientific object, which spins off into the soul being, quote, incontrovertibly real because of how we act, which then means we can find the, quote, true meaning of life in the universal subjective, whatever the fuck that is. But enough about that baffling point. Let's get back to the vague communists of unspecified variety. That all attempts have failed because the proletariat were basically bad people and the bourgeoisie were good. Pipping in a moment here because these idea seeds will bloom in this video. This is where he set up the dichotomy between the oppressors, who are actually good, and the oppressed, who are bad actually. Therefore, the power hierarchy is just and good. So, abandon your ideology, I guess. His examples here were Russia and Germany in the early part of the 20th century. Section 3. The fatal attraction of the false idol. Dropping that historical thread, Peterson argues that the current isms are, quote, practically speaking, quote, monotheists, because they are operating with an unproven belief system. But remember, dear viewer, this doesn't make what they're doing a religion, because in the Petersonian two-box system, religion only asks the person to do the difficult thing, not everyone else. He proposed how a, quote, ism system comes to be. Basically, it's an abstraction of a real problem with artificial villains that distorts reality, and the person who came up with it gets rewarded with higher status in a new hierarchy. Relevant to something we'll come back to in this video, he gave the example of poverty as an ism, then went through the many reasons, in his view, why someone may be poor. Many reasons that, on further inspection, seem to frame a person's impoverished state as an inevitability. That's just how the lobster cracker crumbles, me bucko. He, maybe intentionally, left out solutions from the isms, possibly as an implication that the ism will never provide a solution, only villains to crusade against. He brought up the difficulty in solving big problems, as they are large-reaching, complex issues, then asserts, quote, ideologues brush all that aside for the, quote, easier and more immediately gratifying ism process. He says this is a preferred game of, quote, incompetent and corrupt intellectuals, who soon gain followers that are less capable, so they bungle the ism, which the founders probably roll with because they want to be a cult leader. The followers eventually buy into the ism hard enough that they eventually, quote, criticize the idea of fact itself. Peterson says Marx did an ism about economic class, without providing any sort of citations for the sweeping generalizations of Marx's work. I had good reason to use his debate with Zizek on Marxism as the background for that quote. Then he says the postmodernists swapped out money for power because the, quote, implementation of Marxism has been a, quote, disaster everywhere it was attempted. The postmodern ideologue is like a religious fundamentalist, but worse, because as Peterson sees it, at least the fundee is constrained by God. We were warned to steer clear of monotheistic ideologues, but seemingly not content that he'd made his point, set up the next subsection, looking into the hidden motivations of the isms. Section 4. Ressentiment. We spent a bit of time in the previous video going through Nietzsche's Ressentiment, as Peterson seemed to have only gotten the citation correct, not the actual interpretation. In Peterson's version, the person at the bottom of the hierarchy of whatever hostilely blames the successful tops and the system they're in. Do note, dear viewer, that this sort of blame was not present in the cited portion of On the Genealogy of Morals, or related works supplied by the translator to help understand Nietzsche's Ressentiment. Peterson went through the Ressentiment, quote, causal chain of thought, which seems to be something entirely of his own creation, not Nietzsche's. The end result of this thought chain is the moral justification for the hostile bottoms to attack the successful tops. He claims that the ideologues will always assume the, quote, victim's innocence and the, quote, perpetrator's guilt, without specifying what sort of situations these people may have been in. We went through a former client's story that he had shared in 12 Rules to give some insight and context for his view on victims. Peterson argues against presuming the guilt of the, quote, accused, again, devoid of context. Continuing that thought, he argued against assuming, quote, group guilt, with the closest thing we have for context being the, quote, class enemies of the USSR. While analogous situations can be found in the world today, I kind of doubt he would say they would count. The one most salient to me is the genocide happening in Gaza and Palestine more broadly, seeing as how he's gotten cozy with Netanyahu. So, fundraiser link next to the video there for the Palestine Children's Relief Fund to try to, even just a little bit, counterbalance the fucking shit he's doing. And without a doubt, what's happening in Gaza isn't because of any of the isms that he listed off as being problematic. So yeah, that is roughly where we left off last time. This time we were picking up with the Path of Ressentiment. So if you are on the Ressentiment concept, do check out the previous video before this one, because yeah, we definitely spent some time making that clear. You can also spend some time looking through my merch store on Fourth Wall, and all sorts of hoodies, stickers, mugs to let the world know about your pedantic citation-needing self, or any little chaos dragons in your life. So this one is new-ish. It's embroidered. It's soft, but it's not like the super soft. I'd say it's a little heavier weight than the super soft, but it is embroidered, so it'll last longer. I also have added like a crop hoodie that I'll show you probably later this video, or here. Brain's not braining, sorry. you can support my edutainment endeavors in other ways. You can leave a like, subscribe. I will absolutely take pity likes and subscribes because owie, please. Let's set a goal, because that apparently does things. If we can hit the 42,000 subscriber mark, I'll do something. What that something is when we hit the magic nerdy number, let me know in the comments what I should do. That was English. Finally, you can join my Patreon or Patreon-like options. So there's Patreon Original, there's Fourth Wall, which is basically like a Patreon clone, sorta. Or you can join the YouTube channel wherever the join button is. For the Patreon-ish options, I can guarantee you scripts, behind-the-scenes stuff, special colored flair on the Discord server. Oh god, blue screening on my brain. Good. YouTube subscription, you get special little emojis, and I can open up more emojis so more people join that. But I definitely would suggest the other two because YouTube takes a huge cut. All that's linked below. Right, with that awkwardness out of the way, last little thing to do is the quick refresher of the visual cues I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book or integrating my thoughts with a citation. All one of them that's left in this chapter. Along with this being the Nietzsche nook. And we're over here and not over there because, you know. Yeah, Peterson's got one whole citation left in him, and it's sad. Really demonstrative of the things he's wanting to reverence versus everything he isn't. We also aren't out of the Nietzsche abyss just yet, although this time it is self-imposed so that we can very thoroughly dunk on Dr. Peterson with his beloved Nietzsche. And now it is time to watch in awe as a man projects his own two-box mode of thinking onto the thinking of everybody else, complete with dire predictions based on that assumption. We're going to start this with the little field trip into Nietzsche I mentioned, to a different section of one of the books Peterson referenced, on the genealogy of morals, the third treatise this time instead of the first. The Nietzsche knowers in the audience connected the dots in the last video for where this is going. So for the Nietzsche noobs like myself, let me set the scene. And again, huge shout out to Hegel and Grantor the Academic for their help on this. As discussed in the recap, a key element in Peterson's version of ressentiment was blame, and not part of what he had quoted for Nietzsche. I asked the known Nietzsche knowers on my Discord if this was part of ressentiment or if it was Peterson's. The answer was that Peterson's definition was not matching Nietzsche's, and that blame wasn't a part of that. But Nietzsche did incorporate an element of blame elsewhere. So let's get to that elsewhere bit now. Basically, if you think of blame as pointing the ressentiment somewhere, Peterson himself does it with his advice that we're going to cover in this video. And he does it in a way consistent with the, let's call it a character type Nietzsche described, the ascetic priest. How many times am I going to say aesthetic instead of ascetic in this video? Place your bets in the comments now. Ascetic broadly means someone who doesn't partake of the joys our fleshy biomachines can provide us. Nietzsche notes that ascetic ideals has meant many things to many people, which indicates to him that a fundamental human will is the need of a goal, even if that goal is, quote, nothingness. In classic Nietzschean fashion, he doesn't want to be misunderstood, so he'll elaborate. I will do my best to summarize. We're going to skip to the relevant parts for this video, which means we're not covering what Nietzsche argues the ascetic ideal is to artists, so we'll pick up with the ascetic ideal to philosophers. Schopenhauer, like many philosophers, had a, quote, peculiar irritation at and rancor against sensuality. Every animal has an instinctual drive towards existing in conditions that allow it to achieve its, quote, optimum, which is more equivalent to gaining and having power than being happy. So, the philosophical animal, quote, abhors marriage, as being hitched would obstruct their optimum. The ascetic ideal meaning to a philosopher is the, quote, optimum condition for the highest and boldest spirituality, which will affirm the philosopher's self and philosophy, distinct from the world. These philosophical ascetic ideals lets them, quote, float above life rather than in repose. Of the three aspects of asceticism, poverty, humility, and chastity, Nietzsche focuses on the last. Specifically, that the chastity of philosophers is a result of their productive energies being devoted to their creative children, their work. The sensuality drive is spent on their philosophizing. Nietzsche argues that philosophy has always leaned into ascetic ideals. Early philosophy was striving for the forbidden because the modern importance of truth, reason, and freedom were bought through, quote, spiritual and physical torture. Historical or ancient or very early philosophers had to cloak their philosophizing under, quote, frightful means, with types being priests, sorcerers, soothsayers, or other religious types. This necessitated the ascetic ideal philosophers have come to be known for. Does it have to continue to be this way? I have it on good authority that in this, Nietzsche was arguing that philosophy needed to ditch the priestly garb. The time had come where they could just philosophize out in the open. No need for all the smoke and mirrors. Philosophers, as ascetic priests, are dependent on the ascetic ideal's value. From a distant enough perspective, all life on Earth could be understood as ascetic. Ascetic priests seem to be a recurring person type throughout history across all demographics, suggesting that this is a natural response to, or part of life. I'm going to sound like interpreting a tarot card here, but an ascetic life is ruled by self-contradiction and ressentiment, wanting to become master over life itself, disapproval of bodily well-being, beauty, and joy, pleasure found in destruction of self and the ugly parts of life, quote, triumph in the ultimate agony. Ascetic philosophy will focus, quote, upon what is felt most certainly to be the real and the actual, a triumph against reason, excluding it from truth. Nietzsche sees ascetic philosophy as a necessary step in development, to be able to look at things from multiple perspectives, objectively in the sense of putting aside, quote, one's pros and cons. He says caution is warranted against, quote, pure reason, quote, knowledge in itself, or, quote, objectivity, as we can't separate out the perspective of the thinker or seer or knowledge haver. Asceticism is a paradoxical survival cope in domesticated men. Remember, he saw the then modern European culture as having muted people's natural instincts, drives, and wills, that they'd been domesticated. This taming of man results in a, quote, sickliness where there's tension between the will to life against, quote, the desire for the end. Big quote. The ascetic priest is the incarnate desire to be different, to be in a different place, and indeed this desire at its greatest extreme, its distinctive fervor and passion. But precisely this power of his desire is the chain that holds him captive, so that he becomes a tool for the creation of more favorable conditions for being here and being man. It is precisely this power that enables him to persuade to existence the whole herd of the ill-constituted, disgruntled, underprivileged, unfortunate, and all who suffer of themselves, by instinctively going before them as their shepherd. Tell me that doesn't sound like Peterson and his lobster army. Him being the shepherd to his disgruntled, suffering flock. But Nietzsche immediately follows this with, quote, this ascetic priest, this apparent enemy of life, this denier, precisely he is among the greatest conserving and yes, creating forces of life. The ascetic priest is able to provide his flock the will to keep on going despite their suffering, despite his inherent life-abstaining stance. Man is, quote, the sick animal, because we have the capacity to think the big thoughts and fight for, quote, ultimate dominion, and as such, can also be tormented by the future. But even this sickliness, at its darkest anti-life points, reveals reasons to keep on living. Nietzsche says that inspiring fear in others is fine and normal. Inspiring nausea or pity, as the sick do, is, quote, calamitous. Combining those two would result in, quote, the last will of man, his will to nothingness, nihilism. Here is where we get to something somewhat similar to Peterson's version of ressentiment. Another big quote. Here, in the swampy sick ground, the worms of vengefulness and rancor swarm. Here, the web of the most malicious of all conspiracies is being spun constantly. The conspiracy of the suffering against the well-constituted and victorious. Here, the aspect of the victorious is hated. And what mendaciousness is employed to disguise that this hatred is hatred? These failures, what noble eloquence flows from their lips? How much sugary, slimy, humble submissiveness swims in their eyes? What do they really want? At least to represent justice, love, wisdom, superiority, That is the ambition of the lowest, the sick. Be sick, make a forgery of virtue, then monopolize it. There is among them an abundance of the vengeful disguised as judges, who constantly bear the word justice in their mouths like poisonous spittle, always with pursed lips, always ready to spit upon all who are not discontented, but go their way in good spirits. The species of moral masturbators and self-gratifiers. The will of the weak to represent some form of superiority. Their instinct for devious paths to tyranny over the healthy. Where can it not be discovered, this will to power of the weakest? This seems to be much more in line with what Peterson was doing with Ressentiment. Why he chose to reference the earlier portion of On the Genealogy of Morals will remain a mystery to we mere mortals. However, it is interesting that what we're going through now does give us an interesting interpretation of what Peterson is doing with his platform. It's also sadly funny that, as I implied, these could be used by Peterson and his reactionary friends to describe the progressive left, but at the same time, do a pretty good job painting a picture of the very same lobster-rich reactionary right. It's all a matter of perspective, I suppose. But the thing to not lose sight of in this Spider-Man no you situation is what's the endgame of the two sides? If each side got their way, what would happen to women's rights, LGBTQ people, children's education and work status, and so on? The Ressentiment men's, quote, triumph of revenge would be to, quote, poison the consciences of the fortunate with their own misery, so that the fortunate's good vibes are tainted by the misery of others. But that would impinge on their, quote, right to happiness. So the sick must be kept away from the healthy. Improving the health of the sick must fall to the sick. And now we are arriving at the, quote, meaning of the ascetic priest. Last of the monster quotes. We must count the ascetic priest as the predestined savior, shepherd, and advocate of the sick herd. Only thus can we understand his tremendous historical mission. Dominion over the suffering is his kingdom. That is where his instinct directs him. Here he possesses his distinctive art, his mastery, his kind of happiness. He must be sick himself. He must be profoundly related to the sick. How else would they understand each other? But he must also be strong, master of himself even more than of others, with his will to power intact, so as to be both trusted and feared by the sick, so as to be their support, resistance, prop, compulsion, taskmaster, tyrant, and god. I could keep going with Nietzsche's description of the ascetic priest, as it all seems terribly relevant to Peterson. Like, need to be a, quote, enticing and terrifying predator. Quote, as the herald and mouthpiece of more mysterious powers, determined to sow the soil with misery, discord, and self-contradiction wherever he can, and, only too certain of his art, to dominate the suffering at all times, and the hurts he caused that he can fix. I trust you probably get the gist. Finally, we come to the part that loops back around to why we're talking about this in the first place. What the ascetic priest does about the herd's ressentiment. The ascetic priest defends the sick herd from itself, in part by redirecting their ressentiment. The sick need someone to be responsible for their suffering, to get an anesthetic effect and deaden their pain. The ascetic priest tells the sick that they are the ones to blame for their suffering and ressentiment. This redirection of ressentiment renders the sick relatively harmless to the healthy while promoting self-discipline and growth. The last point we'll touch on here is that the ascetic priest does fight suffering, but not the cause of it. Christianity is a highly effective tool in consoling the sick herd. Hopefully I've made the case that Peterson fits the bill for a Nietzschean ascetic priest. He is operating from within the slave morality mindset, using it to try to help the sick herd deal with their suffering and ressentiment about the state of their lives by turning that ressentiment back in on themselves. Allow me to enter into evidence. Exhibit A.
To take the path of ressentiment is to risk tremendous bitterness. This is in no small part a consequence of identifying the enemy without rather than within.
For completeness, I'll note that he does give us some examples here. Like, go check to see if there's pigs flying, because holy shit, right? Examples. They do fall into a sort of Mad Libs pattern. So if money, power, men are perceived to be the problem, then those who are wealthy, powerful, men are perceived to be the enemy. Although this is a spot where we, the reader, could have figured out the examples from the preceding context. Even more so had he given us examples in all the previous spots I've called for them. But thank you, Dr. Peterson, for these examples. It seems like he's falling into the same trap he accuses progressives of in this very chapter. In these examples, he is abstracting the issues down to their most simplest, non-nuanced form. In some circles, this is called selective strawmanning. Yeah, it would absolutely be reductive to say that anyone with some fraction of power is a cause of the world's suffering. That's why you tend to only see that take on spaces like Twixter by people who could use some time fondling along. But that isn't to say that the existing power structures, and the people up the chain in them, aren't at the very least culpable in many of the suffering-inducing problems in the world. You'll see this as we continue this thought, but it seems like he's assuming people fighting for systemic change haven't done any introspection on endogenous sources of unhappiness or suffering, or to use his phrasing, quote, identifying the enemy within. Oh, but that's what I'm reading from this. And then there's what he probably was intending in his good old obtuse writing fashion. Because I've read ahead, I can say that he's going to tread the well-worn path of setting your house in perfect order before you criticize a world from 12 rules. That you need to get your internal ducks in a row before you concern yourself with the worldly geese trampling your flower bed. We'll cross that argument bridge when we get there. But I can't shake this implication that progressives are resentimenting outwards when they should be directing that in on themselves. So instructeth the ascetic priest. I feel like that either indicates he hasn't seriously engaged with progressive ideas, or he's abstracting and simplifying things down to make his argument. In some of the lefty content I engage with, I've seen some thought-provoking analyses of the person's own wealth, power, gender, etc. status that made me reflect on my own and how I interact with the world. Peterson, as a licensed as of recording time, because people do ask, clinical psychologist, should know how complex we all are, that we can be a member of a group and also criticize the group, that we can work on the internal and external problems in parallel. We're not running on a 386 process. More broadly, this advice is reinforcing the idea that you are the problem, not anything external to you, just you. I should mention, he's going to be running with a lot of assumptions. So it is indeed fortuitous that we have the computational bandwidth to keep track of it all.
Such division of the world into the devil without and the saint within justifies self-righteous hatred, necessitated by the morality of the ideological system itself. This is a terrible trap. Once the source of evil has been identified, it becomes the duty of the righteous to eradicate it. This is an invitation to both paranoia and persecution. A world where only you and people who think like you are good is also a world where you are surrounded by enemies bent on your destruction, who must be fought.
Let's take a look at this argument. Premise from the previous quote. The path of ressentiment means someone is only identifying the external enemy. Therefore, self-righteous hatred against the external evil as a consequence of the ideology. Premise. The righteous must eradicate the identified evil source. Premise. Feelings of paranoia and persecution will follow. Conclusion. You're fighting against your ideological enemies, resulting in bitterness. This has problems. It is possible for someone on the ressentiment path to be exclusively focused on the external sources of suffering. It doesn't have to be that way, but it is possible. We discuss the idea more thoroughly in the last video as well as later in this one, so for now, we'll be generous and just take it as read. The subconclusion assumes that ressentimenting people will break the world into the devil and saint boxes he's described, and that this is being driven by their ideology, and that it will result in, quote, self-righteous hatred. Claims of this nature, especially with the wide net he's casting, demand support, and not just from 12 rules or maps of meaning, outside credible sources that can back up his assertions. I admit I have a bias here, but by and large, I think that leftist people can contain or harness their anger responsibly. Protests, contacting representatives, boycotts, things of that nature. Although looking over into the far right, Pearson's description may be chillingly more fitting, as discussed in this PBS NewsHour cited on screen. He just keeps on with that assumption, building the doom spiral that will follow onto it. That this will lead to feelings of paranoia and persecution because reasons. that this will warp your worldview into an us versus them mentality, where you need to, quote, eradicate your enemies before they destroy you. The thing with that is, some minority groups are either now or could soon be in serious physical danger because of conservative associated ideologies. Trans people aren't being paranoid about threats to their existence. It's really clear what the flurry of laws and name lists are building towards. And it isn't some Oprah-ish sending everybody to whatever gender-affirming treatments they may want. Palestinians are stuck between an oppressive regime bent on their destruction and a militant group ostensibly fighting for them, but using them as human shields. They are literally being eradicated, war crime after war crime. And prior to this, they were being persecuted by the Israeli government. Related to that, Jews around the world are at risk because of some combination of people assuming that just because somebody's Jewish, that means they're also Zionists, and they're also very much in favor of what's happening in Gaza and/or, this being an excuse to fly their anti-Semitic flag more publicly. To reiterate, these groups, among others, are facing real threats because of conservative ideologies. The anti-trans fear and disgust campaign, anti-Muslim sentiment crossed with violent colonialism, and old-fashioned anti-Semitism, all from ideologies. It is morbidly funny that Peterson has managed to describe the path of reactionary conservative ideology here, which seems to have largely been shaped by Fox News. As said in this Mother Jones piece, quote, "All roads lead to Fox News when tracing back the culture war," pushing the idea that, one, there is an average American, and two, that the average American is persecuted for being white or male or having guns or whatever. That it is their righteous duty to stand up to the woke mob in the name of their freedom. That the left is, quote, bent on their destruction. So fight on, brave patriot. And all of that has led me to a kind of weird place. For a segment of the population, it might actually be beneficial for them to follow Dr. P's advice here. Don't worry about the enemies being sold to you, and instead, work on yourself, bucko. Too bad Peterson's not one to follow his own advice, with the self-righteous many-fronted war he's fighting on Twixter against his many perceived evil enemies. The, quote, much safer morally alternative that Peterson proposes is basically the same as from 12 Rules, Rule 6. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, with all of the purple prose that you would expect from him. So we're gonna jump in after he's gotten the style madness up to full speed.
It is probable that your own imperfections are evident and plentiful, and could profitably be addressed as step 1 in your Redeemer's quest to improve the world. To take the world's sins onto yourself, to assume responsibility for the fact that these things have not been set right in your own life and elsewhere, is part of the Messianic Path, part of the imitation of the hero in the most profound of senses.
Ugh, again with this messianic hero archetypal bullshit. No small acts in the Peterson universe. It really is just more of the ascetic priest sermon, even dipping into the Christian anesthetic by saying the reader could take up a, quote, Redeemer's quest to improve the world. Somehow, through auto-ressentiment, by assuming that you are the problem. I feel like this is a pretty solid representation for two of my complaints with his portrayal of this book. 1, this is not a standalone work. That last paragraph would practically be a word salad if you weren't familiar with his previous books. Not that the meaning is much enhanced with that knowledge, but at least I understand the bigger point he's trying to make. 2, in addition to being the book form of video game downloadable content, it's such a retread of 12 Rules. Time and time again, we're seeing the same arguments and ideas. It's like Wendy's chili. Yesterday's unsold hamburger meat reheated in a new form. Except chili is a lot easier to swallow. Ma'am, this isn't a Wendy's. Why are we getting such repetition? I imagine the version that would appease Occam the most is that Peterson is fully on that grifty, so why put in more effort than is needed? People eat that shit up. And maybe. We already know he's seeing how much of the laborious and time-consuming process of doing research he can offload onto the least woke language machine learning model he can find. But something I keep coming back to is a comment from the documentary on him, that In his wife's prophetic dreams, he is the thing that will save us from ourselves.
She dreamed it was 5 minutes to midnight, the end of the world. And Jordan is there to save us from that.
And from the end of that documentary, that he realized that
the best story will win. I hope that what I'm doing is telling the best story. And I think if it doesn't win, then something that is really not good wins instead. And I'm not comfortable with that as an alternative outcome.
Now, I don't know what's going on inside that lobstery bundle of nerves he's got, and the closest I've ever been to him was the nosebleed section at one of his speaking events. So all of this is just speculation from someone who has closely read his advice books. Part of me wonders if he's repeating himself like this because, and I think we can all agree on this, the world is even more fucked than when 12 Rules for Life came out, even from when this book was published. So obviously, his advice didn't get us further from metaphorical midnight than we had been. Surely that can't be because his advice book wasn't the best story, winning its position at the top of the story hierarchy. No. It's because people didn't read it, didn't understand it. And so the way to fix that problem is to say it again, but in a slightly different way, which is a pretty solid strategy in communication. And I think it's probably at least part of why I was solidly reviewed as a lecturer. If I was explaining a concept and I looked out to the class and saw just a sea of confused or blank faces, I knew I hadn't explained it well. So instead of just repeating myself, I would try to find a different approach. Maybe an analogy, a weird different way to define it, just anything to say it in a slightly different way that hopefully people would understand. And in Peterson's case, if this framing is true in the deepest parts of his being with a capital B, there is so much more at stake than just a bunch of students not understanding what the medulla oblongata is. It could be the end of the world. Granted, the world he's trying to save is from the good old days, the nostalgic never-was of his youth, when men were men because they were culturally and socially forced into the men box, whether they liked it or not. Progress is essentially killing that world. And instead of seeing the betterment for so many groups and people, he seems to only see the changes that are being asked of him. As a true anti-ideology ideologue, he has to put his foot down on the profitable Daily Wire platform and do what he can to stop the oncoming catastrophe. Not the environmental one, or the frighteningly expanding financial one. No. The one coming from the woke mind virus that's infected we progressives. Yeah. With that tangent done, let's get back to this quote. We're getting the same messaging as 12 Rules. That we are deeply flawed, so should focus our efforts in improving ourselves first. This will then trickle up into improving the world, because Christ. So speaketh the ascetic priest. But don't get it twisted now. Just because we're talking about needing to abandon our ideology, with ideology severally defined by Michael Frieden as involving the, quote, ideas, beliefs, and attitudes, consciously or unconsciously held, which reflects or shapes understandings or misconceptions of the social and political world, doesn't mean we're talking about politics. Silly. This, needing to be the archetypal redeemer and take the world's sins onto yourself by looking to yourself for the errors of the world,
is a psychological or spiritual rather than a sociological or political issue.
Pretty bold move there, bucko. Telling us to abandon a thing, then going on to redefine the meaning of that thing, thereby losing sight of the actual point of the thing. It's like 5-dimensional Twister, because it sure as fuck ain't chess. But maybe he will save it with his rationale for being the redefiner once again. Nope. No, he won't. The redefiner decided to talk about good and bad fiction writers. Skip. Ascetic priest says, what?
It is much more psychologically appropriate and much less dangerous socially to assume that you are the enemy, that it is your weaknesses and insufficiencies that are damaging the world, than to assume saint-like goodness on the part of you and your party, and to pursue the enemy you will then be inclined to see everywhere.
Ah, yes, that social danger of not assuming you're the problem in everything. Definitely, quote, much more psychologically appropriate. Yeah, this is building onto his idea of the creative conservative shtick from Rule 1 of this book. That before you can become the creative conservative capable of cautiously transforming the world, you need to gratefully take your place at the bottom of the hierarchy, even for environmental concerns, because not doing that will negatively impact your mental health. Because reasons. I'd definitely say it's for the best that he's not seeing clients anymore. All of this advice, while very ascetic, doesn't seem like it would help most of the people in therapy. Like, in what universe is it helpful to tell people to assume that they are their own enemy? Worse, that it's their, quote, weaknesses and insufficiencies that are damaging the world. That's such a basic depression brain move. It slips right into the negative ideation of the world being better off without you because, according to him, you are damaging the world. Now, depression havers, imagine your therapist telling you this. I fucking can't with him. But of course, he's framing this as for the greater good.
It's all about the greater good.
Because it's better than assuming, quote, saint-like goodness, which will result in seeing and, quote, pursuing the enemy you will then be inclined to see everywhere. Of course, those are the only two possibilities. Either we assume ourselves to be saints or sinners. There is no room for anything in between. Not in this secular society. But the case could be made that he isn't intending this advice to be taken in a sort of therapeutic manner, even with that psychologically appropriate comment. However, these ideas are appearing in a life advice self-help book written by a clinical psychologist. That would seem to suggest that the target audience are people looking to DIY themselves some therapy-like effects, no? However, in keeping with that weird realization earlier, this advice may be best suited to the conspiracy-minded, particularly those in Peterson's sincere, uncritical readership. To say it in a less black-pilled way, it would probably benefit them to disconnect from social media for a bit, stop worrying about the enemies everywhere, and spend some time getting okay with themselves. And this is where that content advisory kicks in. In that regard, this is echoing Rule 6 from 12 Rules, with the portions talking about the Columbine shooters and Peterson's friend who died by suicide. These people saw enemies everywhere, and it led to the suffering and death of far too many. However, their perceived enemies, as described by Peterson, were not the same. In Peterson's description, the school shooters saw everyone as an enemy, implying that perhaps if they had been able to be broken of that idea, things would have turned out differently. But that seems very different from his description of his deceased friend. Really, it seems more like Chris was embodying Peterson's advice here. From what's written, it seems like he saw himself as a very guilty member of the patriarchy, the North American colonizers, and of, quote, despoiling the planet. As such, he saw it his ethical duty to fix that. Peterson lumping Chris in with the mass murderers here seems to indicate that he isn't fully understanding, or perhaps willfully muddying, the difference between someone who would feel suicide to be the ethical choice for the impact they're having on the world versus those who would murder others. Which brings us back to the current advice, and him apparently missing that his friend Chris was feeling like it was his, quote, weaknesses and insufficiencies that were damaging the world. But this advice is fully in line with an ascetic priest. If this advice is successful, and their ressentiment is pushed back on themselves, they will be less of a danger to others, thus preserving the safety of the disgruntled and suffering flock, while also keeping them away from the non-gruntled who have no use for the ascetic priest's words. It would be interesting to know what Peterson would make of being called an ascetic priest, but come on, if the cassock fits.
It is impossible to fight patriarchy, reduce oppression, promote equality, transform capitalism, save the environment, eliminate competitiveness, reduce government, or to run every organization like a business. Such concepts are simply too low resolution.
I may have oversold the black-pilledness of his advice in that last chapter title, but not by much. He's saying these sorts of things are impossible because they're not at a level of detail a person can deal with. Which, yeah, kinda true. One plucky Dolly Parton character probably isn't going to be able to completely restructure and reorient a company so that it'll stop being a patriarchal, oppressive, good old capitalism boys club. Probably. Having realistic expectations for the impact your work can make is important, especially in preserving your mental health while trying to do so. But that isn't where Peterson's going with this. Surprise! For completeness and transparency, we are skipping over where his reference to a Monty Python skit comes up. It's a distracting aside that further irritates by proving he'll provide citations for the most inane shit, so we're moving on.
Similarly, sophisticated large-scale processes and systems do not exist in a manner sufficiently real to render their comprehensive unitary transformation possible. The idea that they do is the product of 20th century cults.
Cults.
The beliefs of these cults are simultaneously naive and narcissistic, and the activism they promote is the resentful and lazy person's substitute for actual accomplishment. The single axioms of the ideologically possessed are gods, served blindly by their proselytizers.
Okay, so these big things aren't, quote, sufficiently real, but souls are? Ain't that fucking great? That sesquipedalian sentence, though, if you strip away the overly fancy words to get to the meat, he's basically saying that all of those things he previously listed cannot be changed. The idea that they can be is just propaganda from the progressive cults. What this actually is, to me at least, is doomerism, but like the totally ecstatic buying in, this is great kind of way. I have to say it disturbs me a bit, how freely he'll slap the cult label onto things. But it is a quick and dirty way to get people repulsed about the isms they may be on the fence about, as well as to discredit the movements or groups themselves. Same with narcissism. It's like his go-to insult for things on Twixter, calling the people involved narcissists, particularly when it comes to the care of trans and or non-binary and or gender-questioning youth. The thing is, in doing so, he's diluting the meaning and value of that word. It's not even reevaluating it into a different definition, it's just shifting it into the watered-down layperson usage of the word, and given enough time of doing that, the clinical weight and significance will be lost. Why is activism what he says it is? Because he says so? This whole quote, it's like, citation, I said so, so it's true. It's at least informative to see that he seems to think activism is a, quote, resentful and lazy person's substitute for actual achievement. There's so many ways to interpret that statement. Is he intending to imply that activism never accomplishes anything? Or that the people involved only get into activism because they're too, quote, resentful and lazy to do things that would net them, quote, actual achievements? Whatever those are in this framework. But hey, good job, Peterson, linking this back to what you wrote earlier so it's not disconnected. This time with the ideological possession of the ism proselytizers, tying into the Christian theming of this chapter. This is most easily seen with his setup of this axiomatic God, where he argues the isms have people taking it on faith rather than critical thought. The current quote is basically a bookend for that. This can also be seen in the section titles themselves, as we'll discuss at the end of the video. For the more secular, these sorts of comments are probably not worth further reflection. But for the more hardcore, biblically inclined readers, I could see the phrasing here turning them away from the isms out of fear. Don't want God with a capital G to think you're straying, and Dr. Peterson said these are gods, so best to play it safe. Peterson's mixing things up for us. Instead of the descent through style-mad turbulence into the chapter ending, this time we are taking a trip on the should train to the terse conclusion. Choo-choo.
Like God, however, ideology is dead. The bloody excesses of the 20th century killed it. We should let it go and begin to address and consider smaller, more precisely defined problems. We should conceptualize them at the scale at which we might begin to solve them, not by blaming others, but by trying to address them personally while simultaneously taking responsibility for the outcome.
Okay, so he wants us to take on more, quote, precisely defined problems, which according to him should be in a scale that we can personally solve. Let's go back to his reasons for why people may be poor, so we can see how well this perspective shift might be able to help us. Let's assume a hypothetical person who wants to help address this issue. They're able to pay for their modest needs, so rent, food, things like that, but aren't able to put anything away into savings. Or in today's fucked up parlance, they're doing okay-ish, because at least they aren't taking on debt. Quote, lack of money is the obvious cause. One that Peterson smacks down is hypothetically obvious, so we'll move down the list. Quote, lack of education. How is our hypothetical person going to help with that? Maybe if they have some spare time and emotional resources, they could volunteer at the local library or at the school's library or something to help tutor kids or otherwise enrich their educational experiences. And while I'm sure that would be greatly appreciated by the kids, it's not really helping change the system that's causing the problem. It's just helping that select group of kids. Quote, broken families. Yeah. Not sure what our hypothetical person is supposed to do about that. Same for most of these. Quote, crime-ridden neighborhoods, alcoholism, drug abuse, criminality and corruption, mental illness, lack of a life plan, and so on. What is the average person supposed to do in Peterson's advice? Well, I'd assume he'd tell the hypothetical person to just focus on their financial situation and get in a good place, and then when they get up to the Warren Buffett levels of financial stability, then they can start working on the larger scale change. By themselves? It seems like it's inconceivable to him that sometimes these problems are these big unwieldy things, because that is what they are. As discussed in this Pew Research report by Horowitz and others, there's all sorts of reasons behind the growing financial inequality in the US. It's not something that the average person is going to be able to address personally with personal responsibility for the outcome. Thinking this could possibly work is bordering on delusional. The absolute shade he's throwing at blaming others here. Going back to the financial situation, there absolutely are people to blame. The assorted fat cats getting rich off the labor of their workforce, among others. The 99% have every fucking right to blame the 1% for the shit they're actually responsible for, if not profiting from. And the 1% should consider themselves lucky if complaining is the worst that happens to them. This ascetic priestly advice will result in the status quo remaining largely intact, especially at global scales, which may be great for someone like Peterson, but isn't for, I don't know, most everyone else.
Have some humility, clean up your bedroom, take care of your family, follow your conscience, straighten up your life. Find something productive and interesting to do and commit to it. When you can do all that, find a bigger problem and try to solve that if you dare. If that works too, move on to even more ambitious projects. And, as a necessary beginning to that process, abandon ideology.
It's almost like he got to the end of the paragraph here and realized, oh, whoopsie doodle. None of that was about what this chapter is supposed to be about. Just stick an abandoned ideology on there. No one will be the wiser. I wisered. He tells people things like, follow your conscience, live your life authentically, but then is dumbfounded, infuriated even, when LGBTQ folks do exactly that. Especially if there's steps involved, social to medical, for them to get to a place where they can be happy in their own skin and life. Same goes for women who are straying from his prescribed and circumscribed path. But that'll be much more obvious when we get to the chapter on marriage. It's a real hoot. Now, it may seem like some of these items feel like they're coming out of nowhere, and yeah, they kinda are. But they're also setting up the next chapter in the laziest way possible. Stick around to the end to see what's next. And though we have been thoroughly instructed to abandon Ur ideology, the esteemed Dr. Peterson will not be taking questions at this time. Well, that chapter was a lotta. Did it accomplish what Peterson said it would in the overture? We were told this rule would, quote, describe the danger of attributing the cause of complex individual and social problems to single variables such as sex, class, or power. So I'd say, not really. In lieu of rehashing this chapter to show all the places it hasn't done this, we'll skip to the chase. Aside from the historical notes, the biggest danger he wrote about was, quote, tremendous bitterness and, quote, paranoia and persecution if you are susceptible to the two box thinking Peterson tends towards using. There's also maybe the danger of the hostile bottoms attacking the successful tops. It would have been more straightforward had Peterson actually described more specific consequences of adhering to an ideology. because that's what he's actually talking about with this, quote, attributing the cause of blah 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 to, quote, single variables. So he's also reevaluating what ideology means in this chapter, because that's always helpful to mix into your life advice. What consequences does he predict for feminists, to pick one of the variables, assuming that's even what he means by sex? What would happen as a result of that ideology? And perhaps he didn't do this here in this chapter, because then there would be testable predictions that could fail to materialize. It's much more emotionally compelling to allude to bad things happening than spelling out what the bad things could be and it failing to materialize. Plus, thinking of sex as a simple variable or useful variable in the sort of context he's implying it to be is just laughably simplistic as it is. An interesting aspect to this chapter was the relatively subtle, for him, integration of Christianity. Aside from the out-of-left-field Redeemer's quest we're supposed to embark on, the Christian stuff was mostly present in the section titles. The wrong places, in the context of the youths turning to the isms for meaning, with where they should be turning to left as an exercise for the reader. Perhaps he is only sleeping for the Nietzschean death of God, implying that no, God isn't dead.
No, that's not dead, it's resting. Resting? Yeah, resting.
And when talking about the modern isms, we get the fatal attraction of the false idol, clearly implying what he said in text. The ideologuettes are worshipping a false god by believing or following the ism. The final section, Ressentiment, breaks his chain. Maybe Peterson couldn't think of a witty way to work in the Jesus Resurrection Act, so just opted to be straightforward, for once in his bloody life. If you compare this to the most similar chapter in 12 Rules, so also Rule 6, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, Peterson's much more restrained here. In that chapter, we got hit with Faust, Cain and Abel, Christ, and the smite-happy God of the Christian Old Testament, in addition to Nietzsche and Solzhenitsyn. Not entirely sure what to make of all of that, just that I found it an interesting change. All in all, I have the same criticism as I did when this showed up in 12 Rules. If somebody wholeheartedly follows this advice, large-scale change isn't going to happen because everybody's instructed to just focus on the small-scale problems relevant to their life. Given Peterson's conservative bent, this makes sense. It's right there in the name. Conserve. The side of the political equation that impedes change. And I do appreciate the need for a balance between impeding and facilitating change. Don't get me wrong. All gas, no brakes is probably not a good way to run a country. Probably. That said, all brakes, no gas means the country car isn't going to go anywhere. Some progress must happen, otherwise we're going to be stuck on the international freeway, and this metaphor has kind of gotten away from me. My problem with this advice is it disempowers people from having an active role or voice in the big issues. It just slaps blinders on them and tells them to just focus on their little problems and don't worry their pretty little heads about the big things. It'll be taken care of. And that just removes them from having any say in what's going on in those big issues. However, as I alluded to earlier, some segments of the population are being weaponized in the culture war, for lack of a better term. They're being sold so many lies about assorted marginalized groups, whipped into a frenzy, and then turned loose on the world. The double-edged sword of everyone being able to research anything and everything is that dis and misinformation can spread like wildfire, and this can be abused by bad actors with platforms. The rallying cry of "do your own research" has led to far too many people coming to distrust the actual experts, instead believing the sweeter tasting lie fed to them by other misguided people at best, people with destructive agendas at worst. What do we do about this? How do we try to shove the horrors back in the box? Despite the utter simplicity of Peterson's abandoned ideology, I think it's safe to say it's not that simple. Divorcing people from their ideologies is a near impossible task. My advice, instead of the blanket abandon ideology, would be to periodically do a sort of mental virus and malware scan. Maybe some nasty perspective or idea has Trojan horsed its way into your thoughts. Like edgy or dark memes or humor can sometimes be the little crack that starts letting water through the cognitive dam. If you find yourself saying something that seems out of character, don't ignore that. Having that feeling of did that just come out of my mouth? Can be a really important indicator that something's up. And the same is definitely true if your trusted friends or family have that reaction to something you said. This could be reflecting you taking the early steps down a path you might not have otherwise considered walking. Ask yourself, is this something I want to continue? Do I really want to end up at that end state of this path? If it isn't, think about where you picked up those things. It might be time to stop following some people on social media, or at the very least balancing out their perspectives with contradicting ones. And also, there's probably not a huge conspiracy of the World Health Organization, the different medical organizations about various issues. Like, when you start dipping into the conspiracy theories and that nature, and you're distrusting the experts in those fields, that's a red flag. Some people are probably fine being radicalized into different movements, but I have to believe that not everybody is. Or at least not the person they were at the start of the process. Like, most people, and I have to believe this is true for most people, so most people probably don't start out being okay with or actively wanting a segment of the population, euphemistically, removed. It's a gradual process that can start from something simple like being in a vulnerable moment and having somebody from that ideological radicalizing group notice you, having a friendly interaction with them. It can be that simple at the start. If you are experiencing that disorienting sense of, is this really who I am? Give yourself time to process through those thoughts fully. If your new friends are pressuring you or rushing you through thinking about that, that's a red flag. Do not let that be ignored or dismissed. Really think through this. And on that cheery note, let's see what the next rule has in store for us. Work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens. I know that's meant to be an invitation, but I can't help reading it like a threat. Until next time, bye.